This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks or the show's website at darshantalks.com.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Darshan Talks podcast. I'm your host, Darshan Kulkarni. It's my mission to help people trust the products they depend on. I'm an attorney, I'm a pharmacist, and I advise companies with FDA-regulated products. So if you have an interest in an FDA-regulated company or their products, this is the podcast for you. So today's podcast is about privacy, and we've had this guest before, and you can go back and look at some of the stuff we've discussed before. But what's really exciting is he has made a change from private practice, being a lawyer, to being a consultant, and there are implications to that. And the implication that we just discussed was the fact that he can now be global about his discussions. So if you are a pharma company, you're curious about global implications of your privacy policies, of your privacy programs, and how it's going to impact everything else that you do. If you're conducting clinical trials in Europe and you're going, well, what is the implication of that in the US? This is probably the podcast for you. So you might be a lawyer, you might be in clinical trials, you might be in something else. So today's guest is currently a senior privacy consultant at Privacy Team. He recently joined Privacy Team. He made the move from privacy lawyer to Privacy Team very recently. He's a qualified privacy solicitor in both England and Wales and Israel, with a strong background in corporate and commercial law. So, ladies and gentlemen, our guest for today, Avishai Ostrin. Avishai, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Darshan. It's great to be back on the show. Thanks for having me again.
For sure. So, Avishai, before we start, what is Privacy Team?
So, Privacy Team is Israel's #1 privacy consulting business. We consult for and act as DPO, which stands for Data Protection Officer, for some of the most exciting startups that are based out of Israel. And, our mission really is to help protect people's privacy rights. So, we do have these really, really wonderful clients that we work for, but at the end of the day, it's all about their customers and protecting their privacy rights and making sure that the world is a better place through responsible technology that our clients create. And so that's Privacy Team. We're based in Tel Aviv in Israel, the heart of what's known as the startup nation. And that's what we do. That's what we specialize in.
So it's funny you talk about the startup nation, and you talked about doing better for the world, which I think is really interesting, because now one of the things you discussed is the difference between being a privacy lawyer and being a privacy consultant. What was the difference there that you think sort of highlights the difference? Why did you change?
Yeah, so for me, there were a few reasons that led to kind of my decision to change. The role of privacy lawyer is an extremely important role. I just want to stress that outright. I think definitely. The privacy lawyers play a very, very important role, especially, by the way, Darshan, you mentioned clinical trials. So if you have a medical product and you are going for a clinical trial in a certain country, in a certain jurisdiction, you will definitely need a privacy lawyer to advise you on that, on that process. And but for me, the switch was really about focusing on one specific jurisdiction. So when I was at a UK firm, I was focusing on UK law, on English law. And when I was at an Israeli firm, I was focusing on Israeli law, to actually having a much more global focus. So being able to go into companies and say, okay, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. Let's look at your privacy program holistically. Let's look at it from a global overview, and be able to, whether you're operating, we have clients that operate in 175 countries, right? So it's about creating a privacy program that works in all of those countries and creating creating technology that is able to preserve people's privacy rights in all of those countries. And so that was really the impetus for my move from privacy lawyer to privacy consultant.
So it's funny you talk about people's rights and privacy. One of the questions I often struggle with is this idea that why should patients, and I'm going to talk about patients, but it really applies to consumers in general, but why should patients trust, like our privacy laws based on the idea that patients can now trust companies, or is it the companies are forced to comply with privacy laws and that protects patients and it's more of a protection issue? So what's your take on that?
That's an excellent question, and I think that it really demonstrates, Darshan, the difference between the way regulation was viewed maybe up until GDPR, which, as your listeners probably know, is the European regulation that applies in the privacy context that was enacted that came into force in 2018 in the EU. Up until GDPR, I think the idea behind regulation was the stick, right? Let's do whatever we can. Let's give these huge fines, these huge, let's chase after people with the regulator had this, this big stick that he or she would chase after people. And that was, how regulation was viewed. You're afraid, you need to comply because you're afraid of getting the punishment. The shift, I think, that happened both in privacy, but in general in regulation, is that it became much more about trust, about the interaction, as you say, between the companies, and their consumers. So the company and the patient, the company and the individual and the consumer, and companies that are successful especially in the tech space, are companies that are able to build that trust. And companies and even governments that we've seen that aren't successful are the ones that haven't been able to build that trust, and who failed on the trust, in the trust test.
I'm going to call you out on that, though.
Okay.
That sounds great in principle, and that seems like we should be aiming for that. But the truth is that how many times has Facebook failed us in terms of privacy? I mean, it's a constant stream as far as I can remember, but they're incredibly successful. So I remember probably about 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, there was this whole discussion on, is privacy dead? Like, do people not care about privacy? And here you're saying that privacy is about trust, and successful companies will be trustworthy and will honor your privacy. So how do we sort of reconcile that then?
So listen, you're absolutely right. I think, but I think the fact that we're even having this conversation about Facebook and about what it's done, and, the WhatsApp fiasco that happened at the beginning of the year. The fact that we're having the conversation shows that this is something that people care about, and they're demanding better. They're demanding better from Facebook. They're demanding better from the companies that hold their data. And that shows, that this mass exodus that everyone was talking about, the messaging platform WhatsApp, who changed their privacy notice, and actually in practice, privacy professionals will tell you that nothing actually changed. Right. But the fact is, in 2021, there was a mass exodus, and people said, we're not willing to do this anymore. So are these technologies still around? Are these platforms still around? Yes, they are. They're very problematic. We have issues with them. As we know, it's very hard for us to let go of these platforms that we've become so dependent on. But what we are doing is we're demanding, as consumers, we're demanding better of them. We're saying you cannot do this anymore. And we're demanding, it's not perfect.
Yeah.
There's still a ton of way to go, but we are demanding better, and we're trusting our data more and more to companies that do make that commitment to consumer trust.
So I think that sounds great in principle again, but I feel like in the case of WhatsApp, there was a way for consumers to sort of show support by or lack of support by walking out. Mm-hmm. However, I think about something like Ancestry.com. Are you aware of the scenario there? What happened there?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
For those people who aren't aware, essentially Ancestry.com and 23andMe and stuff were collecting people's data. They got all this data and then sold it. And I hadn't given my data there, but the truth is that a lot of people did. They have no way of walking out, and the companies are theoretically going to be in a position of saying, "Well, here's the data. We should do better. Let's aim to do better." It reminds me of the Paris Accord, I believe, in terms of climate change, where the U.S. and I'm going to call out the country I'm in, my country, in this, where we go, we're the ones who polluted the world. It's terrible, but now you, India and China, aren't allowed to pollute the world because you should do better. We'll all do better now. Well, you already benefited from this. How is it that you can now be in a position of saying we should all do better? It's the same thing with 23andMe and Ancestry.com, where they're saying, we've already sold your data. You can't do anything about it, but let's all do better. So, go ahead.
Yeah, no, listen, I feel oftentimes when I have these conversations that, it's, and I have these conversations very frequently, like on LinkedIn and other platforms and on, podcasts like the Darshan Talks podcast. I feel that, yes, there are issues and we're working through them. And the fact that we have problems, and the fact that we're talking about them, and the fact that we're that we're surfacing them and we're holding companies accountable is a move in the right direction. Listen, the change isn't going to happen overnight, right? But huge lawsuits against Facebook in Illinois under the biometric data law. We just saw that. Senate hearings, and you're right. It's not going to change overnight. Okay, yeah. Mark Zuckerberg is not going to wake up tomorrow morning and say, "Okay, I'm changing all of our We're changing all of our practices, and we're not going to do this anymore." Right? But the fact that we're having this conversation is a move in the right direction. Let me give you another example, by the way. Apple is a great example. Okay, Apple is a great example of a company that is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Right. Not perfect, huge problems, potential competition issues. I admit and I agree. But here's what I love about Apple, okay? It's not necessarily about the fact that Apple has excellent privacy practices. It's the fact that Apple has elevated privacy to be an issue that people talk about. It's that little the Apple logo that turns into a lock and then they're like privacy. Yeah. Okay, that image in people's minds, in my view, does more for privacy than anything that it can ruin in a day or whatever. But
it's perfect that you picked on Apple. So let's talk about Apple for a second, though.
Let's talk about Apple.
For me, Apple is the prime example, and I say this holding a ton of Apple stock, so I probably should get out of the Apple stock before I have these conversations.
Okay.
but ignoring that, the problem with the idea of Apple is that, yes, they're raised the awareness around privacy. They're talking about the privacy lock. They're talking about privacy labels. We're talking about no cookie policy. But really what they did was they weaponized privacy. And what I mean by that is they said, we're not going to have cookies anymore. We're not going to track you anymore. Except Apple, you actually I hold your cell phone. You know exactly where I am the whole time. What you're really doing is you're taking market share away from Facebook. And that was the real play. It was, and Google said, wait a second, we can do the same exact thing. You have my cell phone. I don't need to track you. I already track you. So how... The loser is Facebook, not not Apple. So I'd love to hear your feedback on that. Yeah.
No, so listen, it's a classic situation of like, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't, right? What do you want them to do there, Sean? What are they supposed to do? No, listen, I completely agree with you. In all seriousness, I completely agree with you that, you know, companies like these large, ginormous tech giants, any move that they make will have well, I guess unintended consequences or intended depends on how you look at it, right? But and that is for the regulators. In my view, that's for the regulator. That's for a competition regulator who understands, you know, an antitrust regulator, the FTC, to come and say, okay, this move was anti-competitive, and you can't do it this way, you have to do it that way, you can't do this, you can't do that. We all remember what happened with Microsoft in the early 2000s when they had their huge antitrust case. And I once heard someone from Microsoft at a conference, this was back when there were in-person conferences. You remember those? You remember those days?
That was like what 35 years ago.
It was a long time ago. Someone from Microsoft who said that was probably one of the best things that happened to the company, because, you know, if you remember, they, you know, it split the company up into different sectors, and it allowed them to have this, you know, instead of being one massive behemoth, they, you know, they had smaller quadrants, and they were able to kind of do a lot better and put out products that were much more beneficial to the world and to consumers. So listen, I agree with you. Anything, you know, you move to the left, you're in trouble here. You move to the right, you're in trouble there. But the trajectory, in my mind, is moving, and the pendulum is swinging in the right direction, at least now. And it's up to us. It's up to people who are in these roles to keep pushing, to keep banging that drum and saying, this stuff is important, this needs to be talked about, people need to care, and hold companies accountable, and hold companies to do better. And that's what we need to do as consumers, and that's what you need to do as an Apple stockholder.
So let's ask a variation of the same question.
Yep.
Does my interest in my privacy, or should my interest in my privacy, also result in an interest in ownership of that same data? And that's a question no one's really answering. People are going, oh, we want your data to be private, and outside, like, the laws forcing it. No company's going, you know what? And we want you to own the data that goes with it. And let's be honest, my industry is as guilty of it as any other industry, especially as much as big tech. So in our industry, one of the things we deal with is we're going to do clinical trials. We're going to collect all your data. We're going to use all your data. And then if we think of something else that we hadn't considered before, we're going to reuse that data in a totally different way and get more approvals and make billions. Well, except when you think about someone like Henrietta Lacks, where her privacy, her data was used, and she and her family never got any money from it. Should privacy rights go hand in hand with data ownership laws and info ownership? Yeah.
So this is an excellent question, and I have to say you've shown your a little bit your allegiance to the concept of ownership over data and monetization of data is a very hot topic, and actually goes to the core of the difference between European privacy law and US privacy law, right? Because in the US, privacy, the data is a property right. Right? In the same way that you own your car and you own your house, you own your data, and you should be able to make money off of that data. In the EU, in Europe, privacy is a human right. In the same way that you can't be jailed by the government if you didn't do anything wrong, the company can't use your data because it's yours. It's part of who you are, and it's part of your personality, your person. It's not a property that you own. And so if you fly over to Europe and say to someone, say to a European regulator, ownership and monetization of data, they'll take 3 steps back and go, whoa, buddy, you're way off. So I think so. It's really, really interesting that that you're making that distinction. In the U.S., absolutely, I think that's a conversation that should be happening. And by the way, there's no right or wrong, right? It's just 2 different ways that countries think about data. So yeah, go ahead.
No, so this is the lawyer in me. I love talking to lawyers because you guys are so freaking smart. It's so much fun to have this conversation. But I love that Europeans seem to view it that way. Like they go, no. Data is a personal right, and personal rights aren't given away. Except the woman who made the most money off of giving up a quote unquote personal right is the woman who wrote Harry Potter. Like, you are allowed to have copyrights. You are allowed to have. You routinely give up your rights and IP to something else. Isn't this just another form of IP?
Well, that's the question, right? Is it so? Is your data the same as the book that you right? She doesn't. The copyright isn't in her name. It's not J.K. Rowling. She's not making money because her name is J.K. Rowling. She's making money because she wrote this work and it belongs to her. But in the U.S., I think it would very much be viewed that way. In Europe, they would say to you, the way that it's talked about in Europe is in the same way that the government prevents you from selling yourself. Right? If I want to go now and say, I will sell myself to, go ahead.
But I mean, you can go work for a football, Messi and stuff, work for the football company. I'm not a sports guy, as you can tell. But, but the point being, you can work for football companies.
They're called clubs.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
Club. There you go. Thank you. And your contract can be sold, and then you can work for another club tomorrow. So in the same way, why is this any different? You can sell yourself, is my point.
It's an excellent question, and that is, it's just where they decided to draw the line. I agree with you. You could very easily have said, no, that isn't acceptable. And if you look at, I don't think this is a qualitative decision, but if you look, for example, at the difference between, European soccer. I'm an American, so I have to call it soccer. I can't call it football. Football is a sport that you play with a pigskin and you throw it, and
when the foot is not used as much. Yes,
exactly. So, but if you look at American sports, you don't sell players, right? They, so it's just a very different.
You do. I mean, you do. Obviously you don't want to use that terminology, but that's exactly what you do, right? You sell players from one contract to another, from one team to another.
They get traded, but it's not this notion that I'll pay you 13 million euros to buy Messi, doesn't really exist, and they'll get traded for other stuff. But anyway, my point is that it's absolutely a question of what countries are willing to tolerate, and where so in the same way, your data, right? Is your data something that you can sell?
Yeah.
Or is it something that we're going to say, no, we're protecting people from themselves.
Yeah.
And, in our belief system, we don't sell data. It's a human right. Yeah. In the same way that, I have a basic human right to, freedom of speech, or,
So we have a question, actually. and I think it's James Joseph. I can't remember, to be honest, but it's off Twitter. And he asked, is my DNA my intellectual property, or is it intellectual property? And I don't know where he's based because I couldn't tell. How would you answer that question if he's asking it?
Well, I'm not an intellectual property expert, but I can actually say that there's an interesting kind of similar question in terms of, is your DNA your personal data? And that goes back, or your personal information, if you're talking in the American terminology. So that goes back to what you were talking about from 23andMe and and those other companies, which is absolutely your DNA is probably the most personal data you can get, right? It is literally you.
Right.
And by definition, no one else in the world. So absolutely, DNA is personal data. Not only that, it's probably considered in most legislative frameworks, definitely in the U.S. under BIPA, the Illinois and HIPAA, and some of the other health laws, absolutely considered very sensitive personal data. In Europe under the GDPR, health data considered a much more sensitive kind of tier of personal data, and needs additional protections and additional consents in order to use it and protect it. So absolutely, it would be considered personal data.
I'll add to that. Number one, I think it's interesting in India, speaking to the levels of protections you need. In India, you actually losing or not controlling that can actually be a criminal offense, I believe, is what the latest law seems to suggest. And I haven't seen it actually go into effect, but I've seen that as part of the levels of control that they want to have. In terms of intellectual property, there's actually a core case called Diamond v. Chakrabarty. They teach it in every law school on intellectual property, and really went down to that exact same question, which is, can you own DNA? So you might want to look up that case. It's called Diamond v. Chakrabarty. And it really came out and said that they couldn't have an interest in that intellectual property. And the laws have been evolving since then, because there has been a situation of, I'm trying to get all my thoughts straight. There has been a situation where someone said, I want to sell my data to these companies. So let's take a step back. You had the Henrietta Lacks case where someone just took her DNA and sold it to a bunch of different companies, made millions off it. I believe it was Johns Hopkins, made millions, if not billions, off of it. Then there were a bunch of different pharma companies who just took cell cultures and again made millions and billions off of it. But then there was a situation where this guy said, I don't want you to throw my stuff away. I want to control my rights in that DNA or in those cell cultures. And courts came out and said, no, you don't have the right to do that. And then there was actually a court case where this guy specifically went out and said, I know I have an unusual allele in my DNA structure. I want to monetize it. So he literally, I think, sells his blood for something like $10 a vial or something. This is going back about 15 years. But so there have been cases on this topic. So we can have a discussion all about it.
Wow, interesting. That could actually, I imagine that can probably be patented, can it? Because
it was a patent. The Diamond v. Chakrabarty is a patent case.
It's a patent case, yeah.
It's a patent case. So there's a ton of stuff there, and that's when you pull in the intellectual property lawyers who specialize in this type of work. And I'm gonna be talking to one in a couple of days. Maybe I'll ask him this question.
Oh, sure. Great, wonderful. Yeah, I mean, for me, it's always fascinating because when I deal with data and privacy rights, but you can never look at this stuff in isolation, right? Everything is always, there are always multiple issues that arise when you're talking about the use of people's data, whether it's IP rights or human rights or data protection issues. There can be HR issues or it's endless, and so it's really that's why I find it so fascinating, because no 2 days are ever the same in my profession, which is wonderful.
It's the best part of doing the jobs we do and love.
For sure.
So I know we're getting close to the time that I know we need to sort of call it together. I do want to point out that during this discussion, well, before we start, is there a question you'd like the audience to answer for us in the comments?
Wow, I didn't realize I was going to get to ask questions. This is amazing. I mean, I guess one thing that I'm always interested in understanding is, like, what are people like think when it comes to, like, privacy, right? What's like your biggest concern? What's your, the biggest issue, the thing that you get up in the morning and you go, oh, this is really something that I want to learn more about, or I'm interested in, or it could be something in the news. It could be something, like privacy and trust, or, some of the stuff that we talked about today. But, like what makes you tick when you think about privacy, and what are the things that I'm always interested in hearing from other people, kind of where their mind is at on these issues and on these topics.
We already have an answer, just so you know.
Oh, perfect.
We have one person, it's James again, I think, saying, I'm afraid other people are using my data against me.
Oh, wow.
That's a really interesting answer.
Yeah, for sure.
My personal perspective on it is, I wonder how much of that I can actually control. How much of that privacy, how much of it is privacy, is lip service to privacy, as opposed to actual true blue, I don't want to know your data, I don't want to know anything about you, I can make do without it. Because a few years ago, I'm sure you've heard this before, privacy is the new oil.
It is the new oil, yeah.
Well, the question is, data is the new oil. That's the word. Yeah. Data is the new oil, and the question is, are we turning off the spigot? And
that's great. I love that. You take the analogy to the second level. I love that.
So during this podcast,
we're fracking. We're fracking.
Exactly. Did we frack data too much?
Oh my God, I love
that. So I'm going to do a quick recap. During this podcast, we landed up talking about privacy and trust. We talked about your change, your move over into being a consultant from being a lawyer. We talked about clinical trials and data ownership, and we talked about big tech as well. Did I miss anything?
No, I think, just the oil and fracking. I mean, we really covered a lot of ground, my friend. It's great.
We did. Nothing in this podcast should be construed as legal or clinical advice of any kind. It is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. For those of you who missed it, Avishai, where can they reach you?
You can reach me on LinkedIn. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and I love to hear from people from all walks and from all professions. So definitely reach out, drop me a line. I always make it a point to respond, and so I'd love to continue the conversation there.
Perfect. And if you like this podcast, please leave a comment and subscribe. You can find me at Darshan Talks on Twitter, or go to our website at darshantalks.com. Thank you. Thanks again, Avishai.
Thank you very much, Darshan. Great to be here again.
This is the Darshan Talks podcast, regulatory guy, irregular podcast with host Darshan Kulkarni. You can find the show on Twitter at Darshan Talks, or the show's website at darshantalks.com.